If you've been thinking about studying theology, but aren't sure how you can make it work with the business of everyday life, or even if it's possible for you, then WTC might be the perfect fit. Our university-validated programs in Kingdom Theology are all part-time and designed to be accessible for as wide a range of people as possible. We combine academic theology with the presence of the Spirit in a way that will grow your faith and equip you for life, work, and mission. Visit our website, wtctheology.org.uk, to find out more. This is episode 40 of TheoDisc. I'm your host, Kenny Innes, and on this episode, I'm talking with Dr Tamara Knudson about oaths and vows in the Hebrew Bible. In narrative literature of all sorts, when a character takes an oath or a vow, the story is infused with a kind of tension that informs and moves the narrative forward. This is certainly true of the Hebrew Bible, and particularly in the stories of key women like Ruth, Hannah, and Abigail. Tamara will help us understand the difference between an oath and a vow, and how they hold profound and transformative potential as we recognise them in the scriptural story. Tamara teaches Old Testament at WTC. She holds a BA from Multnomah University, an M.Lit from the University of St Andrews, and a PhD in Biblical Studies, also at the University of St Andrews. Her work focuses on literary analysis of the Old Testament, with particular attention to the portrayal of female characters, intertextuality, and oaths and vows as poetic devices. I promise you'll enjoy this episode. Now, was that an oath or a vow? Keep listening to find out. Well, great. I'm delighted to have Tamara Knudson on TheoDisc. Tamara, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kenny. It's such a joy to be here.
Well, listen, we're going to talk today about some of your work around oaths and vows, and particularly around women in the Old Testament, how that affects and propels their narratives forward. But first, before we get to that, I have to ask you the three questions for every first-time guest on TheoDisc for us to get to know you a little bit better. So these are three questions that are around things that you return to, things that are constants in your life. So the three categories are a book, a food or a meal, and a location.
Okay.
So first of all, what about a book that you return to?
This is a really hard question.
I know. Someone in the office asked me this, said, what is yours? And I said, I can't answer that.
Yeah. That's not fair, Kenny. At some point, you're going to have to answer this question. I was thinking about a conversation I had recently with some friends in Portland, actually. We were talking about how you know when you've read a good book. It's almost as if the book becomes like an old friend. That's how you know it's a good book.
Yep.
That it's sort of just consoling to have it nearby on a shelf, and you pick it up and you sort of return to right where you left off. And they're the books that change you, I think, when you read them.
Yeah.
If I had to choose, I think I would say novels by Toni Morrison. And maybe to pick one, it would be Beloved, because that one in particular has been really impactful for me. I think there's many things I love about Toni Morrison's writing. I love that she digs into the deep questions, the difficult questions. She doesn't shy away from the difficult, and she does so in an incredibly beautiful way. Just her craft as a writer is exquisite. She also weaves in a lot of allusions to Bible, which is just kind of another fun thing. So if I have to choose, which I do, at least today's answer is going to be Beloved by Toni Morrison.
I did my 9th grade in high school in the States, in Texas,
Okay.
and they made us read Beloved that year, and I'm always glad that they did.
Yeah.
Okay, what about a food or a meal that you return to?
Yeah, so this one is very situated in this season of life, as is the place when I get to that.
Okay.
Because as I was telling you earlier, we have two little ones. We have a 5-year-old and a 19-month-old. So meals right now are about speed, efficiency. But my husband is a really good cook, and he has perfected homemade pesto. So, fresh basil, lots of garlic, pecorino, Parmesan, olive oil. He grinds the basil in our pestle and mortar. So
Mm.
I realize none of this sounds quick and efficient, but he's actually
No, I was going to say, can't you just get a jar?
yeah. No, but it's so much better once you've had the homemade, you can't go back.
Mhm.
But you walk in the door when he's been making it, and the smell of fresh basil that greets you is just incredible.
That's nice. My son is 13 and he still loves pesto and pasta. Simple.
Yeah.
Go for it. Okay, what about a place or a location that you return to?
Yeah, so this one is also really situated in this season of life. My little boy Arlo, he loves to go outside. He would spend every waking moment outside if he could. But he's small, so our outings are literally outside our door. There's a stream or a burn, as we would call it
Mm-hmm.
here. The
Mm-hmm.
Guinness burn goes out by outside our front door. I can see it from my window, and it's got lots of ducks and an occasional heron. And he loves, so he'll bring me his wellies. That's when I know it's time to go outside. He comes walking up to me and deposits his wellies by my feet. And I know, okay, it's time to go for a walk. And we just walk down the burn, and it's beautiful and it's simple. Yeah.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, Tamara. Now we heard a little bit about what's going on with you and your interests. So let's turn to your work here. And so I think a good place for us to start would be people who are listening. Some may be familiar with this concept, some may not. This idea of type scenes or literary conventions in the Old Testament. I think sometimes when we think about the Bible, we don't often think about the literary skill or the art that's behind the actual construction of the
Mm.
narratives.
Well, I mean, to that idea of the Bible as literature, as beautifully crafted literature, um, I think that's something that has really been a delight over the years as I've spent more time, maybe more time than I should have, but definitely more money than I should have uh, studying the Hebrew Bible. The delight of the fact that the God of the universe chose to that this is one of the ways that he's chosen to reveal himself to us, and that he
Mm.
does so through such an exquisitely beautiful text. And then thinking about it and looking about around at the created world around us and the detail and the beauty, and doesn't it just make sense, I suppose, then when we turn to this text that he's given us, that it would be woven through with that same
Mm.
uh, exquisite detail and beauty. And so when it comes to the literary craft, it's amazing what the authors of the Bible have done in creating these stories. So yeah, you mentioned type scenes. That's something that scholarship has recognized over time, that within the stories of the Bible, actually much like within the stories outside of the Bible,
Mm.
there are these repeated scenes that occur. So if we think of outside the Bible, a prominent example that we're probably all familiar with would be like the princess in a castle who needs to be rescued. We know that this is a type scene that comes up over and over again in all different stories. But what's really interesting is when that's played with and it shows up, but then little details are tweaked in interesting ways that catch our attention and often have a lot of significance. And that happens in the Bible too. So some examples of type scenes in the Bible would be encounters at a well. That's one that pops up throughout, and often that ends in a betrothal, but not always. And so it's interesting to think about when you see two characters or more coming together at a well, we start to have these underlying expectations. We might not even realize we have them, but if we've read the stories, just like we would with the princess in the castle, we start to have this expectation of what might happen. And sometimes those are fulfilled and sometimes they're not. But no matter what, it's always it's a place where the author can do really interesting things with our expectations, whether they fulfill them or don't. And so yeah, the Bible has these all throughout, and they become really informative when you recognize them, because we realize, okay, we're being set up to expect something, and then if we're paying close attention, when we see little details being different, then we know we should pay attention to those too. And I think that's a really important part of understanding a lot of literary conventions in Hebrew Bible, and maybe especially type scenes, is that what we shouldn't do is go into a mode of, okay, we have these two people at a well, now we know what's going to happen, and we
Right.
just sort of switch off. But rather we pay more even attention to, oh, what's the author going to do? How are they going to play with my expectations here? And how might that be significant for the story as a whole?
Yeah, so Robert Alter's probably one of the most prominent scholars who talks about this, and he
Mm-hmm.
uses the idea of the Western genre. We all know how the Western story is supposed to go, but as the genre progresses, you see these little distinctions that undermine our expectations. And I was also thinking about this in terms of our current cultural moment. The Barbie movie does this.
Yeah,
At the beginning of the movie, you see this pattern set up of what Barbie's day is like. And then as that slowly changes, you see these distinctions.
yeah.
You begin to have your expectations undermined even within the narrative itself. And of course, they're doing this wider thing about subverting expectations of what male or female roles are supposed to be in society. But I think it shows us that we are used to these well-worn tropes being subverted to bring out greater meaning in narratives.
Mhm.
So your work has your doctorate really focused a lot on the idea of oaths and vows and how they play into the expected scenes and also how those are subverted. Maybe we can talk a little bit about oaths and vows. What are they in the biblical narrative? How do they differentiate from each other?
Yeah, yeah. So it's, I mean, it's such a niche little thing, but I spent, again, probably too much time looking at oaths and vows, and just got it became more and more fascinating the deeper I got into studying them. So oaths and vows, they are different. They're often conflated and seen as the same thing, but actually they do have some quite key differences. Probably the most obvious one is oaths in the Hebrew Bible are made between two people. So they do involve God, often as a third party, a witness. So familiar lines of oaths are what we would call the formula of an oath. Some of them are, may the Lord do so to me and more also. That's a familiar phrase. That's always keying off that this is an oath that's being spoken, or as the Lord lives and as I live. So again, it's between two people, but it involves, God is named or mentioned as kind of an involved party. But with an oath, it's specifically a promise between two people. With a vow, it's between a person and God, and it's a conditional promise. So if you do this for me, it's a request and promise, a conditional promise. If you do this for me, then I will follow through and do X and Y in return. So that's a key difference between the two.
And you've brought to the forefront that whenever you see an oath or vow that's really going to propel the narrative forward.
Yeah.
So maybe we can talk about what kind of effects do oaths and vows have on narrative scenes.
Yeah, I mean they're so simple in one way, and yet they're so powerful. And this was something I really became convinced of as I studied them, that there's so much that you learn about the characters who speak oaths and vows. What kind of an oath or a vow does a person make? Because we have a plethora to choose from. So many different examples of, you have like Saul in 1 Samuel 14, when he makes it actually says it's a rash oath, where he says, anyone who eats before the end of the day, before we've conquered our enemies, they're going to die. And then, of course, Jonathan doesn't know, and he eats honey, and then it's this big problem. So in that moment, it's quite reflective on Saul's character, the kind of desperate oath he makes in that moment. And then, of course, you have, and I know we're going to get to her, but a contrast in someone like Ruth, the kind of oath that she makes that's so selfless and beautiful as well.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot that it tells you about the characters that speak them, but also the way that other people, you learn about other people and the way they respond to. So, for instance, with Saul's oath, when Jonathan's life is all of a sudden at jeopardy, and the troops come around and say, "No, you can't." And so you learn something about the people of Israel in that moment, also about Jonathan. So they can be really informative in understanding the idiosyncrasies, if you will, of the characters in the story that you're looking at. But then also, they have huge power in shaping a story's movement. So sometimes we'll have an oath like Ruth's that's right at the outset of the story. And it just, in Ruth's story, it's so interesting because it starts out pretty grim. There's a famine, and then just people start dying. you know, Elimelech dies, and then his two sons, and we have Naomi bereft, and Ruth and Orpah. So it's this kind of dismal beginning, but then Ruth speaks this oath, and all of a sudden there's some kind of hope for the narrative. But of course, as a reader, the bar is really high. She literally lays her life on the line. And as a reader, it really draws you in to think, well, can she possibly follow through on this? Is she going to? And then the story flows from there, really answering that question. Can she live this out? Can she live out her promise? And so the whole story is shaped by that. At other moments, you have an oath or a vow that appears at a really central, pivotal moment in a story. So Jephthah's vow plays that role in the middle of the book of Judges. Abigail similarly her oath has a central pivotal moment in David's story where the whole story takes a turn because of the oath or vow that's made. So yeah, they can do so much once you start paying attention to it. It's really interesting.
So when you see an oath and a vow, look out, because this is really going to define what's going to happen next. I was a film student, so I keep thinking about like in Last of the Mohicans when the Daniel Day-Lewis character says, "Wherever you are, I will find you," and it's kind of like that's the rest of the movie now, right?
Yeah.
He's bound by that. And so we have this thing where you see an oath or a narrative, it's gonna give context to what's gonna happen next. And you've mentioned a few there, so maybe we can dig into some of these narratives a little bit. Ruth, of course, is often seen as either an odd standalone story in the middle of the OT, or it's set up as kind of a contrast to what happens in Judges, particularly around women, and I think that's true. There's a contrasting narrative there. But you actually point out the fact that Ruth has many links between foundational matriarchal and patriarchal stories within Israel's larger story. So maybe we can unpack a little bit Ruth's oath and how that informs those narratives.
Yeah, it is so interesting, her connections to the matriarchs and patriarchs, and in some ways how she's put alongside them, and we see both her courage, and sometimes she looks better for it, and sometimes, well, she always looks better for it. Sometimes the matriarchs and patriarchs don't look so good for being put next to Ruth. But a lot of the links to the matriarchs come up in chapter 3 of Ruth, but I think her oath really sets her alongside Abraham.
Yep.
And that's something that other scholars have noted. Well, it's so interesting because she is willing to, again, lay everything on the line, leave her people, her place. This is all familiar, because it's all what Abraham is called to do and does do. And Boaz confirms it in chapter 2 when he has his conversation with Ruth, the initial conversations where he says, I've heard what you've done. You've come to take shelter under the wings of the Lord, and you've left your people, your father, your mother, your place. And so it's almost an echo again, which is first introduced in her oath, where that's what she promises to do. Your people will be my people, your place will be my place. What's interesting is I think she's also contrasted with Lot. Lot is obviously her ancestor. She comes from the Moabite line. So Lot is the father of the Moabites. And we know that Lot, rather than clinging to and staying with Abraham and journeying into God's promise for Abraham, Lot separates from Abraham in this really interesting moment where he takes the best land, and it seems like, really has a definitive separation from Abraham at that moment. And so there's other ways where Ruth's story has been read as almost a healing, a bringing back together of that line. So she has a link to Lot as a patriarch too. But what's so interesting, I think, about her contrast with Abraham is, and maybe where that really becomes informative, is Abraham left his people and his place, and we know that was an act of courage and obedience to God. God, in leading him out, promised him a great deal. He knew that even though it was just based on faith, he knew there was a promise of something, which makes it really interesting when Ruth does what Abraham does, but with no promise or hope of anything, really. She's just doing it out of love for Naomi, but then as Boaz explains it in chapter 2, also because she knows Yahweh and she wants to go take refuge under his wings. So it speaks volumes about her character that she's willing to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Then we've got those echoes of the Abraham Lot story. Abraham we know as the father of the faithful, and yet here comes Ruth and becomes kind of almost a greater example of that faithfulness.
Yeah.
A mother of the faithful, as it were.
Yeah.
And that healing that comes out of her faithful oath to Naomi.
Mm-hmm.
Another woman that you talk about, which maybe people don't always think about so often, is Abigail.
Yeah.
So it would be good to dig into her story a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So Abigail, she's such a powerful character. But like you say, she's a little bit hidden until you see her and you see her role for what it is. So in 1 Samuel 24 and 26, there's these two narratives that are very similar. So Saul is out pursuing David to kill him. It's really a battle for power. Saul wants to hold on to his power as king, and he knows that David is a threat to that. And so he's out to get David because of that. And in chapter 24 and chapter 26, there's these kind of mirrored stories where Saul is pursuing David. David comes upon Saul in a moment of vulnerability. So whether it's in the cave, when Saul doesn't realize that David and his men are hiding in the cave, or in chapter 26, Saul is asleep. And all of his men apparently are asleep. And David and his men are able to tiptoe into the camp and get right up next to Saul. So David has these two moments where it's basically the power is placed in his hands to take Saul's life. And in both cases, he shows amazing restraint and he doesn't kill Saul. Sandwiched between these two stories is chapter 25. And it's just so interesting because in contrast, we have David's encounter with Nabal. So he, asked Nabal for help, for food for his men, and Nabal just spurns him. And we know the story tells us from the outset that he's a fool. He's not a very wise man. And David's response, so interestingly, he's just withheld, the opportunity for vengeance on Saul in the previous chapter, but he just flies into a complete rage at Nabal's response. And David makes an oath and says, "May the Lord do so to me and more also if I don't wipe out every single man that belongs to Nabal." And so we have this switch from restraint to just unleashed violence and even being willing to exercise the power that he has, David, to kill his own people, because Nabal is an Israelite. And we also know from the story that that's a really, when a person in power starts killing their own people, Saul has already done that with the priests at Nob, and that's a turning point for Saul. So we're really on the edge of our seats at this moment thinking, is David going to blow it all? And this is the moment where Abigail steps in, and she shows such incredible wisdom in the way that she approaches David. She brings all the supplies, obviously, and all of that is good, but it's what she says to him that's just the turning point. Not just for David, but I think it's a really crucial moment in the book of 1 Samuel and also into 2 Samuel, because so much of those books have to do with power and the way that power is exercised, especially against the powerless. And Abigail confronts David and says, basically, you can't do this. You can't shed innocent blood. Your role, your future is in God's hands. And you, as long as you don't compromise by using your power against the powerless, by using it unjustly, God is going to, she uses this beautiful image of your life will be bound up with the living, and your enemies he's going to sling out from a sling, which obviously makes you think of Goliath. So her speech is incredibly wise and insightful and obviously compelling to David, because he turns around and changes his mind. And then in the very next chapter, he again shows restraint towards Saul, and it seems like it's this moment where that is quite definitive for David, because he goes on to, though by no means have a perfect track record, he is someone who seems to handle power often in a way that he recognizes that God is the one who has given him that power, and God is ultimately the one in power. And there's an argument to be made that significant part of why he lives that way is because of this encounter with Abigail and the lesson that she teaches him in that moment.
I thought it was interesting as I was looking at this that her oath enables David to turn his back on his own oath, right? That
Yes.
she kind of she gives him permission to leave that behind from her oath. And do you know what it made me think of? It made me think of that bit in Numbers 30 about when it talks about the fathers can undermine the daughters' vows if they've made them rashly.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, this is a real subversion of that of those positions.
Yeah, it's so true. I wrote a paper on that actually, the connection between those two texts. Yeah.
I'll need to go and read it.
Yeah. No, it's exactly because of that. I was studying Abigail and then I thought about that passage in Numbers and thought, wait a minute. I think it's a really interesting thing. This is a side note, but I think that is an interesting thing to look at, is the way that the laws are played out in narratives and sometimes reshaped in interesting ways so.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that the roles were kind of reversed there.
Yeah.
We're in kind of First Samuel here.
Yes.
But First Samuel, of course, begins with another really vital vow, and this is from Hannah.
Yeah.
So maybe we can look at Hannah's story just a little bit.
Yeah, Hannah is. So I do think that this theme of power and powerlessness is really important for these books of First and Second Samuel. But I think more and more I'm becoming convinced that just for all of Hebrew Bible, all of Bible, the questions of who grasps for power and what the results are of that, how power is utilized, and how when people are willing to step into powerless positions, think about Ruth, think of Jesus, and that those are there's something there that's tied to the foundations of the biblical story. So perhaps unsurprisingly with Israel's monarchy, this is a really important question, is how will these monarchs use the power they're given? And so it's so interesting that in the book of First Samuel, that is obviously going to deal with that question, starts out with Hannah. And so going back to our type scenes, Hannah is a barren woman. There's friction between her and Elkanah's second wife, Peninnah. And so this is a type scene that's been identified as the Annunciation type scene, where we encounter a woman who's barren. Of course, we know there's many of those in Hebrew Bible, and we expect an important child to be born. We expect at some point an oracle to be spoken by somebody in the story to say, you're going to have this important child and this is what they're going to do. In Hannah's case, and this is where it gets really interesting how the type scene shows up, but then is just reshaped. We have all of those elements. We have, her barrenness, the conflict with the second wife, the important child to be born. What we don't have is the oracle. Instead, we have Hannah's vow. At the moment when we expect the oracle, she's come to the temple. She's outside the temple. We know she's distraught over the fact that she can't have a child. And we even know that Eli is there. So it's all set up. We're waiting. And what happens instead is that Eli misreads the situation and thinks she's drunk. And she cries out to God and makes this vow. And then, Samuel's born. And of course, he's a really important character. But in chapter 2, we have Hannah's prayer. And the theme that runs throughout Hannah's prayer is the use of power, and how when somebody grasps for power and uses it against the powerless, that they are not right with God in that moment. That whoever is put in power is put there by God, and needs to have a heart of humility in that, and that it's God who lifts up the powerful and who sees the powerless and lifts them. And so it's really interesting because Hannah is often overlooked. She's just kind of a passing figure at the beginning of the book. But I think actually Hannah is supposed to be a paragon for the books of First and Second Samuel, and maybe even beyond that, where these leaders who rise up, who are doing exactly what she talks about in uh, her prayer at the outset of the book, who are grasping for power, who are treading on others to get there, that she is this beautiful example of powerlessness that relies on, clings to God, and then has an actually incredibly powerful role and even a prophetic role in the prayer that she speaks.
Yeah, I always think it's interesting that, Eli, he's kind of useless in the situation and thinks that she's drunk.
Yeah.
And so Hannah herself kind of steps into this. Like you said, there's no oracle. Hannah pronounces vows before God what her son will be, her child will be, and also kind of steps into that role that Eli kind of abdicates.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that she then becomes instrumental in Samuel's character as he moves forward. That's kind of the role that he steps into. And that's informed by his mother's character and the vow that she makes. Okay, I think it would be good for us to finish looking at this idea we spoke about at the beginning, that ultimately it's God who is speaking through all these intricately woven narratives. And so if we are paying attention to oaths and vows and how they work in the Hebrew Bible, how does that knowledge or understanding of oaths and vows really form and help us in our own faith walks?
It's amazing to think, we were talking about how oaths and vows shape stories. And so then when we think about the whole Bible, I mean, it's hugely important in the Hebrew Bible, but it goes beyond that too. The fact that the God of the universe, like we were talking about, the God who creates, the mountains and the seas, that he is willing to bend down and make a binding oath with humanity, binding himself in loyalty and love to us. That not only completely shapes the story of the Bible, but it, of course, completely shapes our story too. Yeah, the significance of that, and how it defines even how you step out your door every day. The fact that there's a God who loves us so much, and it goes back to the conversation of power and powerlessness, that in his power, he's willing to become powerless for us. How that shapes how we understand him, how we understand the world, what we understand to be success and power for ourselves, and what it means to be like him. All of those things are fundamental to who we are, and they're really informed by the fact that God is willing to step into a binding agreement with humanity, arguably at mainly cost for himself,
Yeah.
for our good. Yeah.
Yeah. I think at the beginning we spoke about whenever you see an oath or a vow in the Hebrew Bible, look out, because the story is going to take a turn.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, that's true of our story, that whenever we come across or become aware of this oath that God has made towards us, look out, because the story is going to take a turn. And I think as well about the commitment that then we make back to God in response to the commitment he's made to us is a commitment not just of some kind of vague loyalty or faithfulness to him, but to be shaped by his character and to exemplify that in the world, and the commitments that we make to other people.
Yeah.
I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about how he's positioned himself before us, and how that then transforms the way that we live our lives before others.
Yeah, and I think that is a way that the oaths and vows of the Hebrew Bible invite us to respond, to think about, to set ourselves alongside some of these characters and think about, what are the things that I'm willing to lay on the line? What are the things that I'm pursuing with this amount of passion? Is it my own power? Is it security? Is it success? Is it the good of others? Am I willing to even lay myself down for that, and even step into a position that might feel powerless for the good of somebody else? So that I think there's a lot to be learned even on a personal level from oaths and vows.
Well, Tamara, thank you so much. I think it'll be really good for people listening if they went and just sat down and went and read Ruth's story and
Mhm.
Abigail's story and Hannah's story, just read them together and see the way that these women reshape the narrative and reshape the lives of others through their oaths and vows. But thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been a real privilege to have you on, and maybe we'll get you back in the future to talk about that numbers paper. That's interesting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would love that. No, thank you for having me, Kenny. It's been so good.
It was great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Kenny and Tamara, for this eye-opening conversation, which helps us to see how creative the biblical writers were and how impactful the decisions of these amazing women were throughout the narrative of Scripture. In our next episode, Kenny is joined by Dr. Jared Michelson, who teaches systematic theology at WTC and is also the lead minister at Cornerstone Church in St. Andrews. So the topic of their discussion, how we relate what is considered high theology to on-the-ground Christian life and ministry, is something Jared speaks of with plenty of experience. So don't miss this one. Thank you for listening to episode 40 of TheoDisc. Join us next time for episode 41 with Jared Michelson as we look at the relationship between theology and Christian life and ministry. Bye for now.